I want to begin by welcoming you all to Dartmouth. We have guests who've come here from far, from as far as Japan, Brussels, Vienna, Berlin, and London, but also from closer, from the Dartmouth community. There's a big contingent that traveled on a bus with its own hashtag from New York and from all parts of the United States. So I'm very glad that you all made it, and it's really super exciting to welcoming you here. I want to issue a few thanks. The first one goes to Kelly Palmer, who is in the room until a minute ago, at least she was. There she is. Conference administrator extraordinaire, and so if everything works smoothly, then that's thanks to Kelly, and if it doesn't, that's not her fault. It's just how the way things are. This conference has been made possible, has been funded by the Dean of the Faculty Office. They provided a huge chunk. And Noah and I applied for a grant that's only offered every other year to the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences, and we were lucky that our project got chosen. I also want to thank the Leslie Center of the Humanities and its director, Graziella Parati, who hopefully will join us any moment now, and the Max Kade Foundation in New York City, the German Academic Exchange Service in New York City, and the Eugene Lang College at the New School. So as far as funding is concerned, this is very much a Dartmouth, New York venture, and actually as far as the organization is concerned, that is true. Noah and I did this together from beginning to now, and we're very happy to bring you this Bad Hombres production. The events will be taped and eventually archived on our website. I want to thank Ishan Yahoda, who is a Dartmouth first-year student, presently in his Italian class, who set up the website and helped with the program and all other things that had to do with online presentation. I want to introduce now President Phil Hamlon. And if one person does not need an introduction, it's usually the president, so I'll be very brief. President Hanlon is Dartmouth class of 1977. He's our 18th president and also the 10th alum to serve in that position. He joined us from the University of Michigan 4 years ago. President Hanlon is a mathematician by trade, but there is a connection to film. As Dartmouth lore has it, and this is not documented on IMDb. He has an uncredited advisor credit on Animal House. But that may also just be fake news, I don't know. But anyway, here's President Hanlon.
Thank you, Gerrit. Good morning, guten Morgen. It is a pleasure to be here to welcome you all to this unique and sure to be thought-provoking conference. And I've heard already this morning, talking to people, how much they enjoyed last night's screening that kicked it off. So welcome, everyone. As Gerrit mentioned, I am a humble mathematician, and it's great to have a couple of hours this morning to talk to you about the work of Gauss and Hilbert and the other great German mathematicians. Don't panic, no algebraic geometry, I was just kidding. So instead, I simply want to say how delighted we are to see so many writers and scholars gathered together to talk about the evolution of film criticism. While not every German studies or film major that we educate goes on to become a German professor or a movie director or a venerable film critic, still the creativity, the critical thinking skills, the open-mindedness afforded by these subjects help mold our students into thoughtful, engaged world citizens and adaptable young professionals, no matter what path they take with their lives. Film helps introduce us and hone our empathy for people and places that are new and unknown to us. And the study of language itself, the study of film, endows us with an understanding that transcends a particular movie, director, or actor. it deepens our knowledge of an entire visual culture. At the same time, critics of film come away with a greater technical and theoretical understanding of what works and what can be improved, exactly what we strive for when we try to develop the critical thinking skills of our students as they go on to become scholars, teachers, students, and global citizens. Since the conference today celebrates the German origins of film criticism, I do want to take a president's prerogative and spend a few moments bragging about our German Studies department at Dartmouth. A hallmark of German studies here is the enthusiasm and intensity with which our students pursue the language, and thankfully our hardworking, talented students are matched by a department full of fabulous instructors like Gert Germunden, who organized this conference, along with his talented colleague from the new school, Noah Eisenberg. So it's not a surprise to me that this conference, with its unique blend of areas of expertise, comes out of our German Studies department. Indeed, this is a department that actively seeks out opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration through forums exactly like this one. So Garrett and Noah, I commend you both. Congratulations on putting together a conference that not only bridges continents, but highlights the variety of professions that have so much to gain from this conversation. So this is terrific work, exciting. Thank you all for making the journey to contribute to the discussion and your dedication to cultivating and promoting the rich history of transatlantic film criticism. Again, welcome everyone, and please enjoy the conference.
Next up would be Graziella, but she's not here. She's wearing, to her defense, she's wearing many hats. She's the director of the Leslie Center. She's acting chair of Studio Arts. She's on too many search committees. She's also a volunteer with a refugee initiative in Vermont, and she's programming a lot of stuff in the Leslie Center. So she's not here. I hope you'll get to meet her at some point. But we just proceed the program, and I'll turn it over to you.
I don't think I can fill Graziella's shoes, but I will instead do my best to reiterate some of what Gert said in his opening remarks, and I want to thank President Hanlon. I want to thank, of course, all of you for being here. Gert and I have been working on this conference for a number of months now, and without Kelly Palmer, this conference never would have been possible, so I want to extend my gratitude to Kelly as well. Last night, we were fortunate enough to see Hitchcock Truffaut at the Low Auditorium, and there will be 2 additional screenings over the next 2 nights. And I wanted to thank Johanna Evans and Sydney Stowe of the Dartmouth Film Society for helping us to get this off the ground. And so thank you very, very much for that. They've been very helpful. When Garrett and I began the conversation, what seems now maybe a year ago, the major emphasis that we wanted to convey here over the course of these 2 days was the need for programmers, preservationists, curators, and critics to be in conversation with their more scholarly, or egghead if you prefer, counterparts. And this was a conversation that Garrett and I knew on occasion does take place, but doesn't seem to take place frequently enough. And so what we wanted to do when focusing on the past century or so of, to use the German term, Filmkritik, what we really were interested there is not so much criticism on its own, but rather film culture and the different ways in which the love of cinema and the support of cinema, the advocacy of cinema comes into conversation, even if only infrequently, with the kind of scholarship that is done in these hallowed walls of the Academy. And so it was that idea that animated our conversations early on. And we hope, despite the configuration of the room here today, we hope that it will have a conversational spirit and that the podium discussions or the round tables will also take on that character over the next couple of days. We have a lot on the docket. I hope there will also be time for you to take a stroll across the Dartmouth Green and survey downtown Hanover, New Hampshire. For those of us who were on the hashtag bus yesterday from New York City, I want to also make sure that you know that you're big in Hanover already. We've been written up in the Upper Valley News. Some people say you're big in Japan, but we're big in Hanover, which is, I think, bigger than in Japan. Matthias, pardon me on that. In any case, a very, very hearty welcome. Thank you to everyone for making the trek here. We are going to begin a bit early with, should we take a short, should we begin a bit earlier? Now I'm confused. Without Graziella, I need Graziella. All right, I think we're going to set things in motion with our first panel. The crisis of film criticism, what sometimes seems to be a never-ending or permanent crisis. Yulia Komska from German Studies here at Dartmouth will be moderating that panel. And without further ado, I invite Yulia Komska to come up and introduce our three distinguished panelists. So thank you very much again, once more. I appreciate it.
Maybe we could start by asking the panelists to come forward and take a seat. Why not? Thanks to Noah for the brief introduction, and it's a thrilling pleasure to welcome you here. I'm in that haloed German Studies department that fires everyone up here on campus, as you've heard from Phil Hanlon. So I hope we keep doing that for you the next few days with the help of everyone who's a guest here. So it's my great privilege to moderate the very first panel, which is, as Noah said, titled The Permanent Crisis of Film Criticism, and permanent is tellingly in parentheses. I think it's supposed to tell us something, suggestively that maybe it's to be taken in a tongue-in-cheek way. And I'm sure there'll be much to learn about the state of film criticism these days, but my hunch is that the takeaways will probably go beyond any one discipline, as crises and crisis rhetoric has recently spilled into a wide area of branches of knowledge, the media, and finally has also conquered, in a way, politics itself. And I will not go into that right now. So a few words about logistics to add to what Noah has already mentioned. This panel will run from now to about 11, and we'll take a break for about 15 minutes and reconvene in this very same room. For the second panel at 11:15, we're hoping, and I've been reminded by the conference organizers to remind all of you again that the conference will unfold in the spirit of the Socratic method. It will be more of a discussion or a seminar in that sort of ancient way than a series of discrete talks or lectures. And for this reason, I'm just reminding all the participants to speak informally or as informally as you wish for about 12 to 15 minutes maximum, and also reminding very kindly to all of the those of you who are in the audience to keep your remarks short and fairly to the point so that there is a meaningful exchange. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the participants. To your very left, and it's always very tricky facing the audience, is Mattias Frey, who is reader in film studies at the University of Kent in the UK. It was somewhat unsettling to read his bio because of how productive he is, and I managed to summarize it in a paragraph, I think, but there is a lot more depth to what I'm going to say. His numerous articles have appeared in edited anthologies, reference works, and journals, among them Cinema Journal, Screen, New German Critic, and Art Forum. That's just to name a few. In the earlier aughts, he reviewed movies for the Boston Phoenix, and for many years he reported on film festivals for Senses of Cinema. He's also the author and editor of a very impressive number of books, among which at least 3 deserve special mention, and they're also the most recent. Post-War German Cinema, History, Film History, and Cinephilia, 2013. The Permanent Crisis of Film Criticism, related presumably to the topic of this talk. The Anxiety of Authority, that's 2015. Extreme Cinema, that's the latest, The Transgressive Rhetoric of Today's Art Film Culture, just appeared last year. He's busy working on 3 further volumes, in case you're wondering. They're due to appear anytime, as far as I understand. And in his ample spare time, he's also the managing director of the Center for Film and Media Research and also an editor of the journal Film Studies. Today, he'll speak on the eternal return of the crisis. And I should probably introduce all speakers in one sweep and go on to our second speaker, who is Claudia Lenssen, a Berlin-based journalist, author, and film critic. She is impressively, and I'm saying that because I work on radio studies, and I find that in Europe much more than in the States, both a practitioner having received training as a broadcast journalist and a moderator, or anchor rather, and a theorist, a film critic and historian, as well as a Renaissance woman, it seems. She has anchored various events at the Berlin Arts Academy, taught film and theater studies at the Free University of Berlin, written scripts, and worked as an editor for Berlin's Film Museum as well. Most recently, she co-authored a biography of the German film and opera director Werner Schröter under the suggestive title Tage im Dämmer, Nächte im Rausch. I don't know if translation is necessary here, but I tried, gave it a stab. And dimming days, drunken nights, although with Rausch you never know what exactly people are talking about. And that appeared in 2011. And she's also co-editor of a volume about women directors, Wie haben Sie das gemacht? Aufzeichnungen zu Frauen und Filmen. And that appeared in 2014. Today she will speak about the journal Filmkritik. And finally, our third participant, on your very right, is Stefan Grissemann, who has, since 2002, been the senior culture editor at Austria's prominent weekly Profil. Prior to that, he was a film critic at the paper Die Presse. He authored, among other works, a monograph about the director Ulrich Seidel, an updated edition of which was reprinted in 2013. I'm tempted to say that it's very recent, but I think our students constantly remind us that they were still playing under the table when, when we think it's very recent. And also the very first biography of the director in exile, Edgar Ulmer, Mann im Schatten, 2003. Equally exciting is his co-authored comprehensive guide to the film legacy of another émigré, Robert Frank. I guess I'll say this with an American accent, is deserved. Perhaps best known as a photographic chronicler of America in the 1950s. In addition, his essays on contemporary film have appeared in Profil, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Berlin's Tageszeitung, and stateside in Film Comment. Notable is his recent write-up on the New York opening of Elfriede Jelinek's new drama about Donald Trump, subtitled, tellingly, The Burger King. And burger has an H in it. Today, he will address changes in print journalism. Before we all join in welcoming the speakers, I would just like to say that there is a microphone for each one of you, and I think we've been admonished by the film crew that it would be great if you could hold it up reasonably close to yourself, and also for the Q&A session, I will carry the microphone around to just make sure that the quality renders well. Thank you so much, and let's welcome the speakers.
Well, thank you, Yulia, so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Noah and Gerd for this lovely invitation to come here. It's a real honor and privilege to be here among so many scholars and practitioners whose work I know and really admire. Now, what I'll be doing for the next 15 minutes is to give you a bit of acquaintance with a research project that I conducted over a number of years having to do with film criticism. And the chief outputs of this were these books that I have on screen there, The Permanent Crisis of Film Criticism, and also an edited collection on film criticism in the digital age. But rather than try to give you a synopsis or even telegraph any number of findings, what I hope to do is to very quickly illustrate a few of of those findings and perhaps stimulate some discussion with the last slide that will give a few of the big questions that I think are typical of the discussions around film criticism in the digital age, but also before, and that can hopefully bracket or preview or contextualize the discussions that I'm looking forward to. So this project began really about 10 years ago, in 2007, 2008, 2009. And what was happening was that I was noticing a lot of sort of meta-speculation about criticism. In other words, many instances of film critics talking about their own profession, about their own industry, and a perception of crisis, a perception that criticism was coming to an end, or there was a kind of a break that needed to be addressed. And to give you just a brief sense of the instantiations of this perceptions of crisis, think back to 2009, the documentary that many of you may have seen by Gerald Perry on the history of American film criticism. Indeed, I think some of you were interviewed for this film. And if you remember this film, the first titles of this film, a black screen with white letters, say, film criticism today is a profession under siege. Variety reports that 28 film critics have lost their jobs in the last few years. So as a start to a film, as a documentary, a chronicle of a profession, it's downright apocalyptic. It feels more like a disaster film than indeed a kind of a PBS documentary, for which it was commissioned. Think also to the blog that was run by a film critic from this country named Sean P. Means from Utah. And what he was doing was he was making a list, essentially an obituary list, of all the film critics who had been sacked from their jobs. And he got about to 87, I believe, until he himself was sacked from his job at the Salt Lake Tribune. Think also of the ways in which there was many manifestations of a certain idea of a devaluation of film criticism or just film talk. So I think of the Dave Kerr volume about his own writings, When Movies Mattered. Right? If we think of what he's trying to say here is that today film is no longer taken as seriously. Today film critics are not taken as seriously when compared to the 1970s. This was a crisis that was happening in learned journals, so I have some examples here, in the trade press, if we look at this Variety article, internationally, not only in the Anglophone world, and not only in conjunction with film criticism. If we think about some of the books on the right side of this slide, The Crisis of Criticism, but what about The Death of the Critic? These were written by more literature scholars, although taking into consideration music criticism, film criticism, etc. The thesis of the Ronan MacDonald's book was to say, today there are no longer public critics. The days of Pauline Kael, the days of Susan Sontag are behind us. No one takes this seriously anymore. We should go back to those nostalgic days. So this was happening at symposia like ones I've hosted, like the one we're having right now, at film festivals, at the Berlin Film Festival, at Edinburgh Film Festival, etc. This seemed to be a pervasive sense of crisis in the profession. And what is quite clear, even from these selective examples that I've just given you in the last slide, is the many overlapping concerns. On the one hand, there's the idea of criticism as a profession, so the fear of the losing jobs, the fear of the status of the critic. On the other hand, there was also this sense of, well, criticism itself is being dumbed down, right? There were days when in New Yorker they had 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 word treatises on film. These days you're lucky if you get a 250 word capsule review, which you have to then now hyperlink with blogs, put on some images, put on a trailer just to make it sex it up for this supposedly dumbed down audience. There was a real fear about aggregation technology, like Rotten Tomatoes, like IMDb, that somehow this was displacing the role of the critic with information, or at worst, a kind of publicity. A lot of commentary about that. So, in short, this was a crisis that had at its roots, according to these commentators, economic roots, aesthetic roots, institutional, sociological, philosophical, etc. a kind of ontological crisis that was precipitated by a technological disruption of the internet that was having manifestations in the media scene with loss of print review, and that ultimately also had an economic basis, the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. So my response to this sense of crisis, to these overlapping concerns, was to ask the basic question, can we learn from the past? Can we learn from other instances where film critics and others who are commenting on film criticism were able to conceptualize or grapple with the especially intrusions of new media, but other challenges? When were there other productive or unproductive instances of crisis in film criticism? And essentially how I went about doing that was to look for an also international approach, looking at essentially 100 years of film discourse in France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now what I want to do is I want to look, again, I'm not going to give a synopsis of my findings, but what I want to do is perhaps give you a few illustrative examples, tropes that I found in my research. So if we look at this first quotation, again, this is coming from this book by Ronald McDonald, 2007, The Death of the Critic. He has a kind of a quite clear history. He says, before, the critic was a figure to whom a wide audience might look, as a judge of quality or a guide to meaning. These days, however, he or she, the critic, merely confirms their prejudices, the audience's prejudices, inclinations, rather than challenging them. Now look at this, this next quotation from a different author. Now the critic is often expendable in the process of determining what is good art and what is bad art. Or this third quotation, this is a period in which, with the decline of the public sphere, the traditional authority of criticism has been called into question. Now, if we look at where these quotations are coming from, we find that this supposedly break of critical authority, this trajectory of the past where the critic was respected and the present where no one really cares, or is just a sort of publicity arm, is happening at least, apparently, for 35 years. If we look at another common trope in the current crisis, the crisis, or the most recent crisis, shall we say, from 2001, 2008, look to this really firecracker article by Armand White, where he talks about the problem is this: so many interneters get to express their expertise, which essentially is either their contempt or idiocy about films, filmmakers, or professional critics. Those of you, many of you who know Armand White, this is kind of a typical White commentary. But clearly, the idea behind this is a kind of a dumbing down, is a kind of a fear of a loss of education among critics, and a fear of a democratic liberation of criticism from the learned authority to a kind of anyone, a kind of anarchy of opinion. But let's look at a different quotation, one by a different author from a different period. Film criticism is an endangered species these days. Once it flourished, soon it may perish, to be replaced by a consumer service that has no brains and no thumbs. And I'm sure you can maybe guess what era this is coming from with the thumbs. This was, of course, sort of in response to what was then perceived as a real crisis. Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel dumbing down film criticism with a sort of national syndication and a television type of criticism from 1990. But look at this quotation. Typical film criticism, insofar it is not an appendix to the advertising section or practiced by volunteers, says to the public what it already knows, but can't formulate so elegantly. Now here we have a very common, this is also a very common rhetoric from the current crisis, this idea of an intrusion, of a false proximity to the industry, and also this idea of volunteers, so a kind of a non-professional critics who are competing with critics. But we see actually it was voiced in 1957 by the then founder of Filmkritik, which we'll hear more about in this panel. What about this quotation? What is written about films rather confines itself to fascinating but unhelpful stories about production, comment on the behavior of film stars, in fact, matter which is personal rather than critical. Again, a very typical complaint these days that critics are more concerned with Kim Kardashian than they are with the latest film by Michael Haneke or whatever. Yet this is happening, this is voiced in 1926 by Iris Barry in her book, Let's Go to the Movies. And finally, this last quotation, about critics today who retell the exact plot in a moody or bad-tempered tone, add a couple of names and pronouncements, and that's it. Well, that was the now canonized film theorist Rudolf Arnheim in 1927. So just one more trope here, this idea of the declining status of the film critic as gatekeeper or tastemaker. Again, this is a real chief fear. We're already hearing this in the last slide from Almond White about the fact that these days young people, they only look at Rotten Tomatoes. They don't actually find a critic like in the days perhaps of Pauline Kael, Andrew Saris, etc., that they can identify with, that they can build a dialogue with, that they trust. But this was a sentiment that was also clearly revealed with television as well. So there you see this idea of new media as the, and this is just the last slide about this. Again, this is a parallel from the television days. And this was, the first quotation was in response to, if you remember the film, the forgettable film, The Impossible with Ewan McGregor and Naomi Watts. And the publicity campaign of this film was, instead of quotations from critics on the poster, was just a number of randomly selected Twitter users. And this got a lot of press among critics in Britain and elsewhere. But indeed, we see almost the exact same sentiment in 1988 when, indeed, television critics were being quoted on these posters rather than newspaper critics. So to kind of move towards a conclusion here, in my research I found it was actually difficult to find a period of film criticism where there was not a perception of crisis. However, there was quite clearly a pattern or focal points where critics were more anxious than others. And that almost always had to do with a supposed democratic liberation or an anxiety about their authority vis-a-vis new media. Although that new media was not always something like telegraph, television, etc., but rather also changing formats in newspapers, for example. If we go back to the early days, a need to compete with theater criticism, for example. If we go back to the post-war period, when then there was a diversification of outlets for criticism beyond trade papers and beyond broadsheets, when there was a rise of the cinephile monthlies, for example, this was also seen as a huge challenge to established critics. And of course, the ones that I've illustrated more fully in the previous quotations, certainly in the days of Siskel and Ebert of television criticism, and certainly these days quite directly in blogs, vlogs, and the aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes. So in conclusion, I just want to make a few brief points. This conflation of ontological crisis, economic crisis, etc., etc. But I want to make one point quite clearly, even though it may be true that there are certain tropes, very familiar rhetoric across the entire history of film criticism. It does not necessarily invalidate the comments. I don't want to sort of say, well, just because critics have always complained about this, that means they're wrong. Indeed, I'm quite sympathetic to many of the claims. But what we do need to realize is that on the one hand, these are challenges that have been surmounted before vis-a-vis new media. And also, these are criticisms that have been voiced before. On the way to this conference, I heard on the radio a new book, The Death of Expertise. And even though this book is sort of framed by Trump and Brexit and a fear that no one respects experts anymore, in many ways he has the exact same thesis as Ronald MacDonald, to say we need public critics, we need a kind of neo-Arnoldiism that, to my mind and to my research, is a kind of a false nostalgia. That there was never quite, if you go back to the Victorian period, when there was a fear of a diversification and atomization and fragmentation of the public sphere, that indeed was something that has been kind of negotiated before. So although I have a lot of sympathy, especially sympathy with those colleagues who are losing their livelihoods through these changes, I think we need a more nuanced picture of between the anarchy of opinion and between this kind of new Arnoldiism. We need to move forward on that. So I just want to, as the last slide, to kind of perhaps stimulate discussion or to frame discussion for future this panel and others, just list a few of the questions that I found were the kind of yoking questions among both the current crisis and to a certain extent also previous crises, so that we don't always repeat the mistakes of the past, but learn from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mattias, and I think we'll just go straight on to Lenssen. You don't have to stand up if you'd rather not.
Maybe you can help me. I just want to have this slideshow. Of course. Yeah.
Slideshow.
Over here. Yeah. Okay. So I would like to present a personal project here. So maybe we talk about false nostalgia, maybe not. Dear Gerd and dear Noah, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind invitation to this conference. The topic film critique and beyond has inspired me to press ahead with my research for a project that deals with some of the heretofore underexplored aspects of film critiques, historic cultural significance and impact in Germany. I would like to present this project here in the form of just an outline. In an echo of this conference title, I could call it the Journal, Film Critique and Beyond. I'd like to talk about the Journal Film Critique. But please don't expect any bold thesis or final conclusions. I'm not able to present my topic as an already published academic discourse template. At this point, it's just a personal project, a barely structured collection of main and secondary motives in a complex story. Not least, it's also an attempt to reflect the roots of my own practice as a film critic. As far as I can survey this discussion from Germany, this conference can be seen as a part of a string of events including festival meetings and an article series. I'm talking now about Germany. Mattias mostly spoke about the American situation, but I can agree we have this feeling of permanent crisis in Germany too, and there were festival meetings and article series spanning several years that address the change, if not the end of the journalistic genre of film criticism. Can you hear me? Can you follow me? The debate surrounding this crisis of film criticism is not new in Germany too. I don't want to anticipate the conference papers on the current situation of film criticism and film critiques. Nevertheless, I note that my questions concerning the history and influence of the journal film critique are guided by my practical experiences as a film critic. So, first, I want to give you an impression of what makes me now looking back in history. Secondly, I would like to do some remarks on the criteria of film criticism as far as my generation is concerned, and as I learned it as a legacy from the journal Film Critic. And third, I would like to give you an outline of the history of the magazine, but only on the first part of the history of the magazine. And I would like to do some remarks on the context of the magazine. The magazine was bound to. If I give you just maybe one example for the situation today in Germany. For around 10 years, I organized film discussions at Berlin's Academy of Arts. My job, which allowed me the luxury of working as a poorly paid film reviewer, entailed selecting current films to be presented, inviting guests and moderating the discussions, all of which I did in collaboration with the Academy. In 2006, when we planned to discuss the film The Lives of the Others, and when we planned to invite its director Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck, his PR agency got involved. The film had already won prizes and had successfully launched at movie theaters. We invited a film critic who had published a skeptical review from the perspective of an East German. This evening would have offered a platform to debate film and its power to shape collective memory. But things turned out differently. The PR agency saw its task as generating a positive media presence. This is how the agent put it. She would only confirm the director's attendance under the condition that we fly in a film critic from Munich who had given a positive write-up. The Academy went along with this tactic. That was around 2006. Just let me give you another example, and then I switch over to why I would like to do some research on the history of film critique. Another example, when Tom Tykw's film Das Parfüm premiered in Germany, Katja Nicodemus, a film critic from the high circulation weekly newspaper Die Zeit, gave it a merely negative review. She criticized Tom Tykwer for making a so-called consensus movie. And he found fault with the fact that he was presenting production values without giving the characters the necessary depth. Günter Rohrbach, a prominent German producer, and he has his own history with the former film magazine Filmkritik. Günter Rohrbach, nowadays a prominent German producer who had also worked on Das Parfüm and who had temporarily served as president of the German Film Academy. In other words, he is the German Film Academy is German film industry's foremost representative, responded to this negative review in the rival weekly news magazine Der Spiegel. He wrote a fierce polemic against German film criticism, calling it elitist and suggesting that film critics had lost their antenna for popular film. Presumably, all of you know numerous other examples that highlight the film industry's expectations concerning functioning film criticism. There was an ironic punchline to Günter Rohrbach's outcry. Negative reviews, he lamented, damage German film, which is supposed to be a threatened species. But in the same breath, he proudly announced that 5 million moviegoers had watched Das Parfüm even though it had received bad reviews. So the confrontation between film critiques and the media industry, that is the point I would like to stress on, which includes the growing power of PR agencies, is reiterated in Germany in ritualized forms. The list of offended directors and actors is long and includes movie stars who enjoy success regardless of any film reviews. In his capacity as a director, producer, and protagonist of his own films, let's say Till Schweiger, for example, is one of Germany's most successful filmmakers, but he refuses to host press screenings for his own films. With this demonstrative gesture, he excludes negative reviews prior to his film's release. And one last example, years ago, that points to the history of the crisis in Germany. Years ago, Hans-Jürgen Süberberg, I think it was in the 80s, distributed a legendary self-published book in which he meticulously compiled copies of all the abusive reviews his films had received. One might add that I often chance upon shockingly meager results when I conduct research and film historical critique compendiums. That's the other side of the problem. Sometimes sometimes all I find is summaries or copies of PR material that have been edited in the manner of a film review. I don't know, this is not a problem of democratization, but it's a fact in Germany. The consequences of this downsizing of film criticism will no doubt remain in the spotlight during this conference, for sure. With this kind of practical experience as a backdrop, the only thing left to do is, this is my point now, to set a resolute and consistent position, referring in part to the output of the controversial debates on PR and influence of the PR agencies on film criticism. I would like to set 5 points here, and it's more or less a result of my professional work or my kind of understanding of film criticism. I would like to mark the basis of film criticism as follows. First, as long as there is art or cinema, there will be also critique. Art, I think, automatically draws critique because it's ambiguous. Art and culture produces ambiguous films. And ambiguity demands discussion. Critique is nothing more than a form of intelligent exchange, also on the controversy of art. Second, critique and success are not related as my examples and countless others demonstrate. Critique and success are not related. Third, critique, and here I mean the institution of film criticism, is beholden to its object rather than to the reader. It is not meant as a transmission belt that gets viewers into the cinema, but rather as a communication offer. On this basis, I would like to discuss film critique. Its quality standard is oriented on the historical memory, and it reflects on which films are worthy of being committed to memory. Film criticism seeks to stimulate our capacity to perceive, our capacity to think, and it appeals to the intelligence. Fourth, film criticism evaluates films according to standards that evolve out of a professional examination of the work and its context. It doesn't require legitimization to do this. 5. Film criticism is writing on film. It is a personal work with language. It is a constant challenge to open up the linear structure of language in order to transfer an audiovisual spectacle into the different discipline of writing. Good film criticism combines the capacity of abstract thinking and a certain sound style which articulates the emotional flow, the nonverbal qualities of a visual, of imagination, and the realism of fantasy. So one could argue that film criticism in terms of professional art critique holds a tenuous position, as you do in the long-established media these days. In the light of the economic crisis, it is in fact a risk of vanishing altogether. We know that film reviews are not the favorite genre within newspapers. Film reviews are cut down, and film journalism, that is the twin of film criticism as I see it, film journalism is takes more place in the newspaper today. What I do see, however, is that there is interest in discussing professional, qualified critiques. Beyond the need for commercial exploitation and legitimacy debates, one can find surprisingly numerous texts that have been penned for curated film programs, for internet forums, or for online magazines. And there I see ongoing history of what we learned from the old magazine Filmkritik. So the story goes on. Though there's less and less hope that one will be able to make a living as a professional film critic. And here we are touching my special interest in an investigation on film critique, on the journal Filmkritik. As it is seen in this picture, it's from the year 1966. How did the Filmkritik people, how did the publishers of this small German magazine cope with the dilemma between film journalism and film writing? How did they cope with the industry's interest in film criticism as a service? What kind of moviegoers and readers did they appeal to? And what kind of media context did they expose their magazine? What are the facts behind the image which they happened to create? What can we learn from the story? Let me say that in the light of newly inflamed debates on film criticism, it's worth taking a look at the work left behind by Frida Grafe, who is the woman in the center of the discussion on film critique. A critic, essayist, translator, and theorist for a long time, she was the only woman in the inner circle of the historical journal Filmkritik. In our current unclear situation, she has once again come into the focus of interest. Let me give you an example of the afterlife of her work. 10 years after her death, her writings are available in a complete works edition. In 2013, together with two colleagues, film scholar Annette Busch initiated a project in her honor, in Frida Grafe's honor. They presented Frida Grafe's 30 favorite films, her personal canon of world cinema, at a movie theater, Berlin's Arsenal Movie Theater, and invited the commentary of film enthusiasts and artists. It's kind of a living archive, and in this tradition, maybe we can see film criticism as Frida Grafe did it. Her early writing in Filmkritik, her early writing in the magazine, is now widely received as part of the whole body of her work. So there's a connection between the afterlife by editions of the texts and the work with her films. Through compilations of texts and manuscripts, as well as through archive and research work, as well to other key figures of the later story of Filmkritik, of the magazine Filmkritik, Harun Farocki and Hartmut Bitomski have also attracted the attention of young film scholars. In their publications, filmmakers like Christian Petzold and Christoph Hochhäusler refer back time and again to the living heritage of the journal Filmkritik and to Frida Grafe and Harun Farocki and Hartmut Bitomski. So, why should I conduct more research? We are talking about a small format journal that was published between 1957 and 1984. Filmkritik started under the umbrella of the University of Münster. The publishers went to Munich in 1961, which Munich then was the center of German film industry in the early 60s. First in Münster and then for the longest time in Munich. In the mid-60s, when the journal had its highest circulation, there were over 50 over 5,000 subscribers. The exact numbers are unknown. The only full-time editor from this period, Anno Portalas, the spouse of Frida Grafe, kept this information under wraps. So we are talking about a small country, West Germany. We are talking about a small film magazine with about 5,000 subscribers, and the question is, why does it have so much impact on film history, on the history of film criticism in Germany? My intention in the project I want to follow is to place the initiative to found this journal, the core group during the journal's formation phase and its ideology-critical stance into the wider horizon of Germany's cultural history of the late 50s and early 60s. As young adults, they lived, the group that founded the film magazine lived in a destroyed country that had disintegrated into a federal system encompassing various cultural provinces. As the film historian Hans Helmut Prinzler once described the cartography of West Germany as he says, Bonn was considered the provisional capital, the divided city of Berlin was the moral capital, and Munich had not yet evolved into the nation's secret capital. So this was the outline of the cultural situation. These young film critics started a magazine. Film was at that time the most important entertainment industry. Around 60 million Germans lived at the end of at the beginning of the 60s in Western Germany, and they bought 800 million tickets in 1958. In 1988, shortly before the fall of the wall, 60 million Germans bought only 100 million of tickets. So film industry, film was no longer the leading media. The upcoming critics who were on their way, the group, who were on the way to founding an own paper with which they would trumpet a different kind of film culture, oriented themselves on Italy's neo-realist films. 1956, 1957, when the French New Wave was not yet quite started, and that was another strong impact on them. And they broadened their film experience at film festivals in Cannes, Mannheim, Oberhausen, and Karlovy Vary. What did the press landscape in which they were planning to stand their ground look alike? There were special interest papers appealing to the industry at the time. There were program flyers for each film, and there were lots of star gossip, fashion, and boulevard magazines. So that was the point why they really wanted to open up their own film critique magazine. You think I should make a point? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. I guess we could get into the segue in the discussion itself. Thank you so much to Claudia, Lenssen.
Okay, this is on. Thanks for the invitation. So many points have been already pointed out in the last two. We could really enter into a discussion pretty soon. I think since I've been invited here as a practitioner, not a scholar, but a man who works tirelessly for 30 years now in the hack business of writing reviews. Maybe I was thinking about criticism at the crisis. I find it interesting that etymologically it's the same basis. Both words stem from the same source, so the internet says, which is already part of the problem, I guess. So maybe the crisis has been here so long that nobody notices it anymore. It could be. When I thought about it at home, how much of a crisis is there in what I do? I picked up some newspapers or film magazines that I had at home, and I thought, well, actually, it's pretty much alive and kicking. It got more extreme, probably. That's what's happening actually. If you're looking at, I brought a few examples, like CinemaScope, a Canadian magazine. They run stories about Roberto Minervini, Christy Puyo, Ken Jacobs, and other people. Normal film goers don't really will probably not know. So it's a pretty extreme, esoteric, if you wish, theme choices. You have Film Comment. The one that I grabbed is the one with Son of Saul on the cover. They also have Charles Bronson up there, but they didn't put him on the cover. So that's also something, sort of a choice. It's also, I would say, not a commercial film magazine, even though of course it tends more towards the commercial. We have an Austrian magazine called Kolik Film, which is probably the most esoteric of all. I mean, it has an egg on the cover. It might be associative of Chien Andalou by Luis Buñuel. I don't know if anybody shares that association. So. This is the cinephilic side of film criticism that exists. The other side, of course, is what's being published in weeklies, dailies, monthly papers, and of course that is usually very commercial because the pressure has set in. There's a lot of pressure on all of us, and we all work with chief editors, let's say. Slightly disinterested, culturally slightly disinterested chief editors who then, time and again intervene in what we do, but only in the fact that they ask us, is that something our readers are interested in? I work for a Profil magazine. It's like a serious weekly. It's like a Time magazine or Newsweek in the States. Of course, there's always a debate in the conferences. You always say, yeah, of course, it's interesting and it's absolutely crucial to portray a certain avant-garde artist. But you also of course have to feature Tarantino or David Lynch or whatever they might have heard of. So that's of course what we all do. We make a compromise. We make compromises for those kinds of papers. You don't have to make compromises for CinemaScope, of course, but that's a different matter. I don't think I don't know if that's actually also already a sign of a crisis to make compromises. Maybe it is, but I think actually that writing about a Tarantino film or a David Lynch film or a Michael Haneke film, to do that on a high enough level can be interesting and can be rewarding for everyone. It's not a sellout to write about a Tarantino film. So that's what I'd like to say. First of all, preliminary, that I don't think that film as a topic has lost its glamour or sheen. I mean, I realize that even chief editors who have nothing to do with culture so much, they say, yeah, let's do a David Lynch story because they have heard the name and they think, okay, that's a weirdo that people might be interested in. I was asked to say what has changed over the years. I started in the late 80s. I actually used an electronic typewriter then, so a lot has changed. But two things that have changed, which is clear to everybody, and which hardly has to be emphasized, is of course the internet, online journalism, amateur criticism, blogs in myriads of ways are discussing film online. There's a lot more competition to whatever we write. The other thing that I don't think has been mentioned yet is also, and it has also to do with digitalization, is that a lot more films get produced and made and are directed because it's so easy to make a film for $1,000. So we have a lot more films to write about, which might also be a way to avert a certain crisis, because there's a lot to discuss. So, in fact, there's a lot more to read. There's a lot more to write. Question would be, where's the crisis? Maybe we can discuss that in a second. I think there's two ways actually to react to this a lot more of everything syndrome. The one thing is hyperactivity, of course. I mean, any working critic doing this profession today will do a lot of things at once. He will not just write reviews. He will also, visit film festivals. He will talk to industry people. He will talk to politicians, art politicians. He will moderate film premieres. He will, write liner notes for avant-garde DVDs. He will write. I mean, there's tons of things to be done as a film critic. Most people think, of course, he's only writing his bad or negative feelings about films because he's such a loser or something. I mean, that's a common misconception of a film critic. Is negativity. That's one of the things that's I think very important. That being a critic means one who passes judgment, maybe, but also one who's able to make judgments, which is a little bit more diplomatic. In English and also in German, it's always been tainted with this sense of censorer or fault finder. So with this negative implication, I don't think at all that the profession of film criticism is not even closely limited to being negative about things or finding faults. I think really it is a profession of differentiation. It is a profession of emphasizing certain things, of creating awareness, of making things clearer maybe, and to of course make historical comparisons. This is very important. What cannot be denied is that it is important to have a certain spiciness going with your film review or film, writing, because otherwise nobody is going to read it. If you're just endlessly dialectic or ambivalent about everything and see all sides all the time, it's not going to be really entertaining. Question will be, I guess, in a few seconds, whether it's actually interesting or necessary to be entertaining. But I think journalism has something to do with also a sort of seduction of readers. You have to create a sort of work that creates some sort of aura or at least interest in going on. I mean, this is not, film journalism is not science. Film journalism is not scholarship. It's hands-on. Being close to a work and mediating its implications, but not doing that in a dry or cynical or doing it in a seductive way. I don't find a better word for that. So for me, really good criticism has to do something with literary ambitions. Also, it doesn't have to be literature, but it has to at least have the ambition of being a sort of work or a text that could be also read if you're not only interested in thumbs up or thumbs down. Is it 4 stars or 5 stars? You have to be interested in a certain text on a film. Even if you're not going to the film, you will have to want to read the text, then it's good film criticism for me. Another thing that changed, of course, is the marketing aspect, the advertising aspect, the abuse of film criticism as a piece of service. That's of course happening all the time, and that is different from the late 80s when I started. Back then, we were actually the clowns of the art section in a way. You know, writing about things that knowledgeable or weird people love to read, and everybody back then even thought it's necessary to have that, but we don't care about how it's written and what it's about. Just let them do it. That has changed a little bit. We're not really free in that sense anymore, but we are free in another sense, and this is maybe the last point that I'd like to make, is the powerlessness of criticism today. I mean, I think many colleagues think this is a problem, that film critics don't actually have the power anymore to damage a film or ruin a blockbuster at the box office. That doesn't happen, obviously, and it doesn't even happen for art house movies anymore. And I think, for me, it creates a kind of freedom that's maybe interesting, because when you're not responsible for the box office hit or failure of a film, it's much more free to, it's freer to you have more, how do you say, yeah, it's possible to get closer to a film and not be have it on your conscience to ruin a film. One thing that always interested me most is, even if I hate a film, I'm not against people going there. I'd like to point out why I hate it, but I also would want that people who read my review and are a totally opposing opinion would also have a certain would maybe say, okay, I know this guy, he is so much the opposite of what I like, I'm going to see this film by all means. I would want this to happen, because that's, I don't want to only write for the converted or people who think like me. That's, I think, is not a great ambition to write film reviews. And also, it's not a great ambition to write film reviews to say, I want all you guys to be of my opinion. This is also not so. This is the sort of ambivalence or ambiguity that has to be in every good film review, in my opinion, to be that it's able to, that readers are able to read between the lines and not just have a certain opinion, not opining, not judging, not being the high priest of film art, saying I waggle my finger and say this is not good, so don't go to see this film. I think film criticism has another and a more open and more interesting and important job to do than that. Maybe we can enter into the discussion now.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. Such a fascinating breadth of insights here, some of them conflicting and maybe contradicting each other, from Mattias's point about taking the crisis rhetoric, if I may use the expression, I'm somewhat hesitant, seriously but not literally. And then Claudia's point about the tyranny of positive thinking and how that impacts criticism and how maybe we can recover other eras when this wasn't the case. And then quite the opposite coming from Stefan about, the intensification of the industry and the kind of the power of the powerless deriving for the role of the critic and that. So let's maybe discuss and take questions, and I'll run around with microphones. I should have worn sneakers. I knew that. It's on.
I have a couple of broad questions. First of all, what do you think about the quality of criticism in The New Yorker.
Mic's not on.
Right?
It's on.
Yeah. The question, I have a couple of questions. First of all, what do you think about the quality of criticism in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the New York Times? And my second question is very broad.
Yeah.
What do you think about the impact of events like the Golden Bear and the Oscars on film criticism? There are two different questions, very broad. I hope. Is it okay? Yes, thank you.
Could you introduce yourself too with your question?
What?
So we know who you are. Could you introduce yourself also with your question?
I'm Narayan. I write for the Times of India, but I live in the Upper Valley.
Okay.
And I teach media studies at Norwich University, which is a military college. Thank you.
So as I understand, the question is about the major media outlets and the status of film criticism there. So the New Yorker was named Atlantic, American publications. But maybe we could also go to Europe and you could draw some parallels and contrasts there. And then the second was about festivals and prizes, right, and the role of film criticism in that. Is that correct? So maybe you could each say something about this. Make sure that your microphones is...
The second question was about the influence of Golden Bear and Oscar on film criticism. Yeah, well, I mean, I can only talk for myself, but I mean, it's since the Oscars and the Golden Bears are usually being awarded after you have written about films, the influence is pretty slim. You could, of course, come back to films that film like Moonlight that you might have not, grabbed in the first instance so big. You can of course elaborate on that after the Oscar has been won, and it's of course an interesting sign of the American film industry if they award a film like that its major prize. So of course it has a certain influence on your choice of topic. It doesn't influence, I think, any of us or any any serious film critic in his or her opinion. We've all had it that really bad films won the Oscars, really bad films won the Golden Bear or the Golden Palm, or I mean really bad according to some of us. So I mean this doesn't change anything. It's only a sort of indication for the condition of an industry maybe. And as to New York Times, Atlantic, and New Yorker, of course, the level is very high. And I mean, I don't read it extremely regularly, but I frequently come back to reviews, especially from the New York Times and the Atlantic, and I always find it fascinating how in depth and informed those reviews are.
I think Berlinale, Golden Bear or Oscars, yes, I would agree. They don't influence writing on film. It's part of film journalist work to comment on that. But it's a different species, film writing, film criticism, and these comments on, let's say, festival. I think that it's part of the game that you cover both, but we all write on films maybe 4 hours or 6 hours before the start, and that's part of the game too. You have to find your judgment, your personal writing, according to the first or after the first press screening, and sometimes it's 8 months until the Oscar is on screen. Yeah? So it's different jobs within the same field.
So just 2 quick points to your second question. I think the Oscars are important in the agenda setting. So what Stefan is talking about, okay, who is commissioning these articles to begin with? Often it's not the critic himself, someone higher up. To give you a parallel, when I was writing the book on extreme cinema, I found through my research that the Guardian newspaper had written 38 articles about the film Nymphomaniac by 1 month after it had premiered. And of course, because it's going through the festival system, the chief editor says, oh, this is a film that has sex in it, that is going to kind of interest our readers. And so you have different editors at the newspaper, at the website, that are commissioning article after article. So in terms of sheer publicity, and in terms of sheer quantity and volume, then something like the Oscars is quite important, if not for the individual critics themselves. And the second point is about the role of associations of film critics and the awards that they give. Now, a very interesting colleague of mine wrote an interesting article about the ways in which associations like the New York Critics Circle and other critics associations, which, by the way, have been with us since the 1920s in France and Germany, when critics were binding themselves together to, among other things, leverage themselves against the industry. Now, in her article, what she was saying is that the ways in which these associations, on the one hand, are trying to kind of distinguish themselves from the Oscars and from these awards and from the glamour. At the same time, they use these awards to indulge that. So it's a kind of an interesting, I won't call it schizophrenia, but a kind of a multi-directional pull that these awards and the association awards are pulling on film critics.
Everyone to introduce themselves.
Yes. My name is Carrie Rickey. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. Thank you, Mattias and Claudia and Stefan. My question is, to what extent is this crisis we're talking about, the migration of advertising from print media to digital media, and are not getting remuneration? And to what extent is the crisis about the general switch from film to digital, and the quantity of movies? I know that when, in 1986, there was 176 movies released in my city, and in 2011, there were 535, and that quantity is, unseeable for a person.
Okay, maybe I'll just say a few things about it. I think you make a very, very good points. When interviewing film critics and interviewing also distributors, also exhibition outlets like Film Forum, this is the first thing they complain about. There are too many films. It used to be on a bad week for them, 11 films would come out. Now it's 25, 30 films coming out. How are they ever supposed to get an audience for that? How are they ever going to get any attention? So I think that's a big issue. Also, I think when we talk about the issue of the digital, we're in a very middle stage. So there's been some responses to this, right? Paywalls, different day parting, different hyperlocalism, different strategies to deal with that. But I think we're such in the middle of that we don't know what's going to happen on the other end. Now, the Murdoch papers, of course, are going, the paywall, Guardian is basically just begging for money, going to a kind of almost subscription model, promoting itself as a brand so that you sign up to their dating site and you get their wine club. So there are different ways that they're dealing with it. I think we're in the middle stage. So I'm almost loath to predict what will happen at the other end. I think at some point the money will have to materialize, because it can't be like today that so many people are working for free. It won't be sustainable. So I would just, maybe it's a kind of a cop-out, but remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, the real crisis in film criticism is that freelance critics cannot survive anymore. That's of course the main issue in a way. I mean, it's almost frivolous to talk about a crisis in film criticism when there's a full-blown media crisis. And print media, of course, are in a way dying. I mean, there will I guess there will always remain a few luxurious, super established papers, but most of the ones that exist today, I guess, will be gone within the next 10 years. That might not be a catastrophe, because of course film itself has dealt with the migration into all sorts of digital arenas, and is not only at home anymore in the movie theaters. That like, you know, in this. Am I the only one hearing this actually, or is it? Something's. Okay.
This is over. We have a question here.
Okay. Yeah.
I only hear you.
You don't hear it?
I doubt if it was ever possible for freelance film journalists, film critics to survive just by writing on film. Concerning the film magazine Filmkritik, what's interesting in the 60s is that there was a controversial debate on the form and function of film criticism. And the one part of the group, or the one fraction, who was very much interested in political way of film writing and ideological criticizing films, they had migrated to different fields of work at the same time. They focused on the ideological criticism while working in the BIPAC Film Critique magazine, but they earned their living as film critiques for the Spiegel, Der Zeit. They tried to create a festival like Gregor's did in Berlin. Then, in the end, in 1970, it became a section of the Berlinale. Others, and that's what's very interesting at that time, they went to the public television, and they created a so-called third program. And what the big media change during the 60s, when film film was no longer the leading media, the leading entertainment media, they benefited from that media change. Those critics who were especially very politically oriented, and they went to they worked for a mogul who collected packages, bought films all over the world, especially for the third program. So film criticism, I think, was never a chance had never the chance to live on that.
I'm Jim Hoberman. I'm a recovering film critic and a part-time academic. And coming back to the Mattias's presentation, I have an observation, and that is the period of the 60s and 70s is the exception, not the rule. And I think that that's perhaps something to study. I mean, maybe without false nostalgia, I don't know, but that might be unavoidable. I think the most eloquent discussion of that, at least in the US, was the article that Susan Sontag wrote in 1996, The Decay of Cinema, which was published for the widest possible audience. In the US, it came out in the New York Times magazine section, so presumably was read by millions of people. I don't know what kind of impact it had there in our little world. At least in the US, it had enormous impact. But the the point that she was making, and I think the point that came out in Stefan's presentation, is that there are now two forms of film criticism. And there's, for lack of a better term, what we might call popular film criticism, and then there's this strange thing, cinephile film criticism. And I wonder if you would want to theorize that a bit.
Theorize it. Thanks, Jim. Well, you know, like I said, I mean, it's in my observation, it's really becoming more extreme. I mean, there's like polar opposites almost. To have like the general interest film journalism that has to deal or wants to deal with a certain kind of film that also has the ambition, of course, of informing people and of pointing out like intricate details of a cinephilic kind, without being too scholarly about it, without being too academic about it, because then you, of course, you scare away general interest readers. And I mean, I think actually that if we are theorizing this, that popular film criticism also is divided in many subsections, and that is not uniform as well. When we're talking about like the New York Times, in my opinion, does popular film criticism, but it does so in a very learned and very informative and very also in great writing. But still, it's not super cinephilic. It's not super scholarly. And then, of course, there's the worthless film criticism. That's all the yellow press stuff is released. But I don't think actually we're talking about that here, because that's pretty self-evident that. That the popular film criticism that's only dealing with Hollywood as a magic word and stars, Brangelina's kind of sort of criticism in criticism, not criticism. I mean that actually is yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but I would not want to include that with serious film criticism, but it's true that there's the stream of film criticism that is devoted to a sort of experience that is not open to everyone, and like a film magazine like CinemaScope is that, and yeah, I don't know. Maybe my colleagues can theorize it better.
Just one quick response to that. I think you're absolutely correct in that about the idea of an exception rather than the rule, and that is my response to everyone, or to most of the arguments about atomization. They say, wasn't it great when every film scholar just read screen? That was the exception rather than the rule. Wasn't it great when there were only 3 channels? That was the exception rather than the rule. In fact, the public sphere has always been divided. It's just now that we can see those divisions more easily through the media. But those initial first grapplings with that media, whether it's television, whether it's film criticism, etc., were more the exception rather than the rule.
Oh, hi. My name is Jeff Ruoff. I have the honor of teaching in the same department as Gert Gemunden. I thought I would add one thing to this interesting discussion of different types of film criticism. There is such a thing as academic film criticism, which is a third type, which is different from popular film criticism and different from cinephile film criticism, such as film critique, and which has arcane rules of blind peer review and an average readership of academic articles is actually 10 people. Not film per se, but across all disciplines. The average readership for a peer-reviewed academic article is 10 people. So there is another type of film criticism, which we do. Proudly. My question is not necessarily for Mattias, but maybe programmers of film festivals have, in the past 30 years, with the explosion of film festivals, have replaced critics as the progenitors of film criticism. Since there's been this just profound proliferation of film festivals, and programming, at least when it's done with some sensitivity, is an act of criticism. If it's the Montreal Film Festival where you show all 500 movies, that were made that year, then that's a different type of film criticism from the New York Film Festival showing 25. So.
Yes, I think when I was interviewing Noah Cohen, the director of the San Francisco Film Festival, he was kind of grappling with that very fact. He said, well, these days film festivals are charged with being art house cinemas. We are film critics, we are distributors, because these films often never go any further than that. So they often say, well, I'm feeling the weight of this task. So I think there is a good point that you can make with that. It's simply being displaced or being taken up by other part of the film culture.
Hi, my name is Bill Phillips. I also teach with Jeff and with Gerd. I was a screenwriter for about 30 years. I teach here now. And I think one thing I've learned over the years is that now that we have Amazon asking people who buy pistachio nuts to review them, we can sort of sort out what film criticism is best at and doesn't need to be doing anymore. It's sort of related to Facebook. You like something or you don't like something, and you rapidly learn that everybody that is your Facebook friend is going to like what you like. I've written about 25 movies as a screenwriter, and I've had good criticism suitable for framing, and I've had bad criticism that I'd just like not to think about anymore. But I think the most insightful, the best insight I ever had about the value of good film criticism came one day when I was outside the English department here. There's a well-known English professor who was pontificating about the meaning of one of my scripts. He really liked it. It was a Jack Reed, Brian Dennehy movie. And when he finished, I said, but Don, I didn't intend that at all. And he said, well, what do you know? You're only the writer. And he said that without hesitation, and I immediately understood something I'd never understood before, and that is there's a lot at play. Even if you spend a year on a screenplay, there's a lot of unconscious stuff that the culture is giving you. And a good critic, I think, can inform the audience about psychology, about history, about film history. Where does what you did fit in to the pantheon of other similar subjects? So I personally, I think the best film criticism is when it elevates. It's not a thumbs up, thumbs down thing.
Yeah, no, I think there are a couple of questions lined up. I'm sorry.
Ties in with the idea, of course, that so many, sorry. Okay.
Was that a comment or a question?
Well, you're certainly invited to talk about this.
No, I just wanted to say that it has something to do with the idea that of course works of art, especially, can be a lot smarter than its creators, and that's also valid for film criticism, of course. I mean, if Elfriede Jelinek, if the famous writer, Nobel Prize winner, she says sometimes it writes through her. She phrases it like that, and she doesn't really, she doesn't know all the levels of critique or whatever she does. She actually hits. So of course it's a cliche almost that works of art can be even more intelligent than their creators, and that's what criticism is all about, actually.
Well, I can attest that Bill's works are more intelligent
Okay. Hi, I'm Lynn Higgins. I teach French literature and film here at Dartmouth. I wanted to ask you if you have any insights into the role of distributors and movie theaters in acting as gatekeepers to the public. I ask this because about a decade ago in France, a bunch of filmmakers rose up in protest against the distributors and movie theaters for closing down films basically on the basis of reviews. And I don't remember the evidence, but they had a lot of evidence that this was happening. And in fact, what they were asking for was a change in the procedure whereby films were reviewed before they were released. And so I don't think that much changed because of their protests, but I wanted to ask you about that and ask you in particular if you see any kind of structural or procedural changes that would alter the landscape that you've been describing.
I would just add to those distributors, exhibitors, I would also add the classification boards as well. All of these things are connected, and in many ways, when I've studied very particular genres like extreme cinema, it's impossible to talk about criticism of extreme cinema without also talking about distribution, without talking about festivals, exhibitors, and indeed those classification boards which are letting it go through. So I think that's absolutely in the mix. And if you look at the history of criticism, it's always in a kind of a love-hate relationship with distributors. I think sometimes distributors have had a quite paranoid relationship to critics, where they, as I believe it was Stefan was mentioning earlier, that they don't want to have a true press screening because they think this is going to just go a lot smoother. I mean, there was a kind of an outroar when Snakes on a Plane went straight without press screenings. Well, I think they realized what was going to happen, of course, if they did that. And to be fair, if you look at actually the empirical evidence, and Stefan was touching on this, there is actually very little evidence that a film critic will have a determinant effect on a box office performance of a film. There's only a minor correlation with some art house films, but for the vast majority of films, there's absolutely no effect. So this idea that there were ever these make or break critics is somewhat inflated. So there need not be this paranoia between distributors and critics, but I suspect it will always continue to persist.
I'm Scout Tafoya. I'm a part-time critic. I guess I wanted to know what each of you thought the enduring legacy of film critique is, and what we're here celebrating it 50 years later. I guess if you could talk a little about what it means to each of you personally and what you think it brought to the culture in general.
I think the film critique and the second period of the film critique from 1970 to 1984, it's kind of a different period, and there were filmmakers overtaking the film magazine. And that was a third or fourth kind of film criticism, which we have not been talking about, which is very interesting because during the 60s in Germany, there were two film schools built and opened, and part of the game, if you wanted to apply to be a film scholar in the film school in Munich or in Berlin, was you have to write on film. And film critique in the realm of what Frida Grafe thought is film criticism, writing on film as a free genre of essay writing has been developed since then. There have been, I mentioned Harun Farocki and Hartmut Bitomsky. They are two key figures. And we have now the magazine Revolver, which is led by filmmakers too. And one can say Revolver is kind of a legacy of Filmkritik. And this is all in the field Stefan and Mattias have been talking about. One could say it's a niche where film criticism survives. It's absolutely not connected with surviving as a freelancer. It's a byproduct of, let's say, the intellectual or emotional debates we all have. It's a part of film culture. And that's what I think is well, it's one of my 5 points. This will survive as a genre, and it's absolutely independent from academic discourse, and it's independent from what Stefan describes as film journalism, but it's not an extra part, it's part of that. We had in around 1966, 1967, Wim Wenders started to write in Filmkritik. Fassbinder wrote on film, and Wenders does it every 3 years. It's kind of a comment. It's kind of a discourse, and it opens up the dispositif of film critique. And that is the point I would like to point out. That's very important to develop this kind of film critique.
The magazine Filmkritik means a lot to me because it's also a model case of you can study with the history of that magazine. You can study the fight or the collision between sociological and political film criticism and aesthetic film criticism, so-called. They themselves called it that way in the 60s when they collided harshly with one another. When critical theory clashed with associative, essayistic film criticism. And I mean, it was a pretty radical film magazine. It actually in the first number already it said that it features non-utilitarian texts that cannot be used to make conversation or money, and it set itself up as an extremely oppositional sort of film paper. And I mean, I've brought here like an example from the first year. It was the 12th issue of Filmkritik, and this, what you see here, is the only photo it has in its like 16 pages, and the rest is just, you know, film critique. It looks more like an instruction manual than a film magazine, but that's actually also fitting because it was an instruction manual on cinema. So and of course, I mean, a writer like Frida Graffe, who is just eternally important in the history of to bring forth a writer like that alone, it would merit its existence.
Just to echo that, the writing itself. And then the second thing is the kind of the lesson, following on what Stefan is talking about and what Claudia has written about. That evolution of the magazine was very important as a lesson about how the writers always felt they needed to stay ahead of the reader. And so when they were relinquishing and that in dialogue, of course, with the distributed films, when they relinquished the sociological criticism, it was on the one hand because all of a sudden they were films that they could positively evaluate, with the birth of the art house cinema and the rise of the new German cinema. At the same time, it was also because they realized that the readers themselves had internalized that sort of critique. So they were becoming almost superfluous. And the critic, if anything, needs to feel that he's adding value to that rather than simply confirming what the audience already thinks.
Yeah, I'm Ruby Rich. Just to go back to Jim's comment about the Susan Sontag essay, as somebody who did an editorial for Canadian radio, objecting to the to the piece, I would just say that I think that that it was a wonderfully bracing argument, and I think one we all might feel a lot of sympathy for. But I felt that it also was maybe not false nostalgia, but real nostalgia for her own previous power when she could be much more determinant in how films were discussed and what was paid attention to. And I just wanted to use that objection to just kind of throw a bit more middle ground into the conversation, which is those sites that are not simply opinion blogs or IMDb or Amazon, but places like Shadow and Act, which can be a really rich place for African diasporic criticism, Remezcla, that pays very sophisticated attention to Latin American film, Angry Asian Man, that isn't just about film, but these are all very smart, written by people who've studied film. I mean, there's a lot of different writers, there's a variation. But I think that these spaces where people who are not idiotic and are not consumer-oriented are worth paying attention to, because critics, we all have our own limitations in terms of our own positions and from where we derive our own authority or notions of authority. And I think that these spaces are often populated by all the people that universities are turning out and who don't have jobs in anything related to their fields, finding a place to continue doing what we love as they love it, which is paying attention to texts that speak to them and writing about film in ways for different, bisected, knowledgeable communities. Not always, but some of the best writing I've seen on certain more popular work happens in those spaces where they're taken more seriously. So I just wanted to kind of run a flag up for that.
I don't know if in the meantime anybody wants to respond. We have space for one more question, unfortunately.
Thank you. My name is Roy Gruntman. I teach at BU, and I've been associated with Cineast magazine for many years. I have one of the things that I thought was really interesting about Stefan's comments was the question of film criticism as a literary genre. The fact that critics have certain styles, very distinct styles, which we all enjoy reading, and that's something that I think deserves more attention and also more discussion here. So this is sort of like a question not just to the panel, but people in this room, you know, how they feel about sort of supporting film criticism as a literary production. But tied to that, I also have a question, and perhaps best for Mattias, because he's been such a great historian of this crisis. And that is, you know, one of the things that I find a little bit ironic, if you think about film criticism as a literary genre, is the emergence of the so-called video essay in film criticism, and how that is or has been changing film criticism as a literary production, or has it? So that would be sort of my combined question and comment.
Very, very briefly, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, when I teach my module on film criticism to my students at University of Kent, I'm often teaching about the literary styles. So some of the people in this room, Carrie Rickey, Jim Hopeman, etc., I'm teaching your work as literature, essentially, to these students who would like to go into film criticism and was kind of analyzing that on even a sentence level. So I think that's a very important thing, because it also has to do with the dialogue between the audience and the critic. You often become engaged with someone like Friedrich Graffe or whoever is your favorite critic or whoever is your past favorite critic because of the writing itself, more so than anything else, because anyone can watch a film, anyone can write about the film, right? That's what the internet has taught us, and yet not everybody is being read. And that's the big difference. About the vlogs, that is a very good point. It's a kind of a new branch out. Finally, for the first time, someone can deal with film in the same way, or deal with the object in the same medium that they're criticizing it. It's something that my students, for example, are very excited about, but maybe I'm too old to fully appreciate. But there are some interesting people, like in Britain, someone like Katie Grant, who is doing some very, very interesting things with vlog and also with the academic video essay. So I think also it's another one, we're kind of in the middle stage. So I think there could be something that's very, very fruitful that comes out of that. I'm probably just too dim in terms of technology to utilize it myself.
Anyone else? Stefan or Claudia?
I would like to ask if your students try to make video essays, do they have a problem with copyright? That's a problem in Germany.
Well, it's a problem that we're dealing with also, for example, even to show clips and now that we have lecture capture in university that the staff have been very anxious about, but the university just says you've got to do it to please the students. So we're kind of in we're being told to break the law.
Well, thank you so much. I think there are lots of questions in the audience, but the day's still young, so this is just beginning, and we'll carry on after a 15-minute break. I'd like to thank our presenters and also all of you for the great questions and remarks, and let's just give them a round of applause.